Welcome back to another episode of Radical Narrative. It has been a while. However, I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be sitting here recording this for you. My name is Mylan, Tootoosis, and I am your host, coming at you from Treaty 6 territory, the Prairie region in central Canada, in the middle of Turtle Island, north of Montana, but in my Indigenous territory, in my home territory. Today on the episode, I'm bringing you a rebroadcast of an episode I did back in July with our friends over there at Southpaw. If you haven't followed Southpaw, be sure to follow them. If MMA is your thing, if liberation martial arts is your thing, Southpaw are the people to follow. They do some amazing fight studies, they do some amazing interviews, and have an amazing liberation-based martial arts curriculum out there you can gain access to through their Patreon. In this episode, Sam is joined by activists Emma Taylor and Mylan Tootoosis for an anti-colonial discussion on de-escalation and community care. I really hope you enjoy it. If you like Radical Narrative, if you like what we do, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Share us on your social media. If you want to donate to us financially, there's links on our Instagram and links here in the show notes. I don't want to keep you much longer. Again, it feels great to be back. Thank you for your love, support, and your patience as we've been adjusting to new changes in our lives. And as always, be sure to stay tuned and listen in.
This is Sam.
And this is Southpaw.
On this special episode of Southpaw, I wanted to have a conversation around de-escalation because I think it's an important topic if it's done the right way. Done the wrong way, and it can erase all the violence marginalized communities face, as well as victim blame, and make it all about personal responsibility and individual choices. So doing it the right way starts with framing. Frameworks allow for discovery while avoiding pitfalls, which is a key concept within the liberation martial arts curriculum. Secondly, we have to have the right guests, and the right guest kind of fell into my lap. Mylan Tootoosis is a past guest, but also someone I talk to all the time about related topics like community care and kinship networks, parenting, martial arts, lateral violence, trauma, and staying wholesome and not taking our frustrations out on others. So Mylan, can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, my name is Mylan Tootoosis. I'm up here in Saskatchewan, Canada, Treaty 6 territory, father of two. Have been doing community work in Indigenous communities, for quite some time, and it's the work that my late father has done in the past, and also my mother, who still is a social worker, has her own private practice based in the community. So that's sort of my background. Also, obviously, so your listeners will likely know that the host of Radical Narrative.
And through Mylan, I met Emma Taylor, who I'm sure will have lots to share in this discussion. Emma, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name's Emma. I was born in Treaty 4 territory here in Canada. I'm currently living in Treaty 6 territory. That's kind of where I've grown up. My background is Cree, Métis, and Irish. Currently, I'm working for a harm reduction nonprofit in Treaty 6 territory as well. I'm a frontlines worker on the opioid and housing epidemic. And I'm also involved in a lot of grassroots work in similar realms, but expanding as well to broader issues regarding Indigenous sovereignty and anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism.
And for people who don't already know, I'm Sam. I'm a Korean born in one Korea, which was cleaved in half by the empire. I currently reside in the US. I've been training in martial arts since I was 6 and now teach the Liberation Martial Arts program. So I've been thinking and writing about martial arts from a liberatory Marxist decolonial perspective for a while now. And to go back to the first intent about proper framing, I want to explain why we're covering this topic in earnest now, and it's probably not the last time I'll cover this. In all of our content, when we talk about violence, whether it's by pen or policy, or more directly through fists or guns, we wanted to prioritize violence against marginalized and oppressed communities, which also includes women and children. Othering and power asymmetries are characteristics of violence. I think about all the times violence or the potential for violence has come to me. Most of those times, it was because of my race. And if someone has the objective to hurt you, then that's the reality you have to orient yourself to. But I remember in one of my conversations with Mylan, he said he was interested in grappling over striking because what if violence is coming from drunk uncle and you just want to restrain him from hurting himself or others? The subtext of this conversation was de-escalation. Now, there have still been times where the potential for violence came to me and it wasn't race motivated or race was just one motivator among others. And by violence, it's bidirectional. I too can do violence to others. I remember a recent altercation where a stranger got right in my face and wanted to fight me. We never met before and never had any previous interactions. And there were some signs that this person was having some break from reality. And I don't know if the cause was a substance or a mental health episode or both. But I was able to de-escalate it by trying to distract, connect, listen. No set of movements, no posturing. But my 4-year-old was there and I was putting him in the car seat and this guy was right in my face. So I was making sure I was a barrier between him and my son. My wife got in the driver's seat and I was able to get in and we took off. This was at a local park and basically the whole park emptied out. It's a mostly white park and the only one who was watching us and yelling for him to get away and for us to leave was the only brown mom there. So even her as a witness and voicing herself let me know someone was watching, gave me a little bit more confidence, and she was already being more than a bystander. And we kind of drove slowly to also watch her get in her car with her family and leave without incident. And even though this isn't a good event to have happened, a friend of mine said it was probably best this happened to me rather than anyone else because I can de-escalate myself to be calm enough to de-escalate him and get away without any violence because it's not just about what could have happened to someone else or me, but also what could have happened to him. He's a big dude with a shaved head, tattoos, a tank top, and baggy shorts. So let's say it escalated to violence and then the cops came. So it's not just about what would have happened to me, but what would the cops in this fancy white neighborhood have done to him? Like, would this have been some viral video clip of cop violence? I definitely didn't want that. But also in the car, we had to make sure our son was okay and not scared or dwelling on what happened. But he was fine. And since it didn't escalate, he didn't think too much of it because I also didn't want to escalate my son with my behavior during that moment. Now, I said the potential for violence, but this guy wasn't yet being violent. And I saw a path where this didn't have to end in violence. But I was making sure I was perceiving him, saw where his hands were, what his demeanor was like. And basically, if I wasn't moving quickly, neither was he. And since I've been an adult and even as a doorman at a bar, I've been able to de-escalate a lot of incidents and also sometimes de-escalate myself to prevent further danger. Like the whole punch a Nazi thing. Yes, it makes for a great meme, but context matters. In the videos I've seen where a Nazi gets punched, the Nazi didn't know how to fight. He wasn't expecting the punch. It was in a crowded situation and the person punching had more numbers. So in that context, it can make sense because you're in an advantageous situation. But if you were isolated and alone with no bystanders and the Nazi is bigger than you and they're with their friends and they happen to yell slurs at you while passing you by, do you punch them or do you let them pass and you then get the hell out of there? In that situation, you're at a major disadvantage and it's probably best to de-escalate yourself and escape. So even in a racist incident, you can de-escalate, but the person you're de-escalating is probably yourself. Some guys in a car yelled some sexually offensive stuff at my wife one time while she was walking with the stroller when our son was still a baby. She chased after them, but then stopped herself and realized that's probably not a good idea. So de-escalation wasn't for them, it was for her, even though it's them who are the aggressors and doing the wrong. But in the end, it would have been her and my son getting hurt. So do you want to be right or do you want to live? So to properly frame things, we need to properly define things. And de-escalation sounds like an academic way of saying calm down. And the last thing you want to tell someone who needs to calm down is to calm down. So I really wanted to call it pausing. But if I said that, no one will understand the topic. So I stuck with de-escalation as the topic term. But as you can see in the examples I gave, I'm using de-escalation as a broad, flexible term. I define de-escalation as reducing or lowering arousal to pause and make a plan. And often the person you are de-escalating is yourself or someone you know. Even at the workplace, there have been times I've been mad, panicked, anxious, scared, and I have to lower my arousal for the sake of my job. As parents, we call this emotional regulation and we teach it to our kids all the time. So it's something we already do and is already useful. And that's something that only exists in workplace safety training. I can teach you all the martial arts techniques you want, but if you're not in a psychological state to apply it, what does it matter? You have to de-escalate yourself to even use it. You have to de-escalate yourself like putting on your own air mask before you can de-escalate others. So let's start here. What do you two think about this working definition?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. De-escalation is all about managing yourself, managing the environment, more so than managing the other person. And the idea is that as long as you're maintaining those two things to the best of your ability, that's going to create space for the other person to kind of return to a baseline.
What do you mean by space?
Well, creating space in this terms of like, not necessarily a physical space, but also creating like an environment of removing any access to weapons, crowd controlling, maintaining the energy so that it's, you're not escalating, the people around are not escalating, things like that. Managing the environment, essentially.
Mylan, what about you?
For me, like to identify myself, I'm a native dude. Like I'm cisgendered, long hair, broad shouldered. I'm a big guy, and there's a certain privilege in that, I would say, when it comes to like physical space, holding space. Like obviously, I'm a visible minority here in Saskatoon, and it does get uncomfortable. But at the same time, for me, depending on the personal or like the professional approach of what capacity am I working in, depending on situations, like having to measure and see really what's going on in a situation, I think is first and foremost important, like really assessing it and getting a feel for what's taking place. Like the examples you gave, especially as a father, they're examples that I could relate to, things that are on the back of my mind, especially in like the political, social climate we're living in. But at the same time, for me, it's really a matter of like picking the battle, so to speak. Because there's situations where I'll just walk away from, there's situations where I'm not necessarily involved in. But if it comes down to like what we're going to talk about, like community care or kinship and people I'm related to, then in my mind, there is a certain duty to respond. But that's also, it's also important to measure like what capacity do I have to be useful in that situation. But I like the assessment and your analysis of having this conversation, because it is something that, especially for me at my stage in fatherhood, it's something I reflect on too constantly.
Emma, how do you teach de-escalation and what are the steps to de-escalation?
Yeah, so there's not necessarily steps to de-escalation. I more so would refer to it as strategies or tools. And the reason for that is that it's important to not be rigid in the process of de-escalation, because it can come off as very clinical, which reads as very disingenuous and sometimes dehumanizing, particularly with the population that I work with. They're very used to being treated in a very clinical or dehumanizing manner. And so the important thing is to kind of make that human connection. So yeah, your approach should always be organic and natural. But some of the strategies, obviously the first and most important one being to regulate yourself. So that's kind of maintaining a calm demeanor, not being reactionary, knowing when to step away if you need to. And I also think it's important to kind of constantly assess situations and decide for yourself whether or not you are legitimately unsafe or if you are just uncomfortable, because that's kind of going to help you regulate your responses as well. Active listening is a huge one as well. Applying emotional first aid, which I can kind of get into a bit more. It just essentially involves a lot of co-regulation, caring gestures, things like that. As controversial as it may be for health nuts, cigarettes are one of the best de-escalating tools you could ever have.
Because you're also connecting.
It's a caring gesture, it's a connection. And also, again, for us as Indigenous people, tobacco is seen as medicine. So especially if you're working with, again, the community I work with is largely Indigenous. There's cultural connotations to that as well at times. Another big one is avoiding power struggles, which can be really tricky. It's you kind of are constantly having to either drop or change your expectations of the situation and the outcomes, validating people's feelings, even if you don't agree with them. And then kind of, as I was mentioning earlier, managing the environment is also a huge factor in some de-escalation strategies.
And by being too clinical, what comes to mind is like, I've had a lot of different trainings in my life where when they talk about showing the other person that you're listening, you repeat what they just said. And I've always found that if you actually do that, the other person feels like you're doing something by the book or almost like mocking them, or like you're not really connecting. You're just going off of a script.
Yeah, that's definitely an example of it. Anything I think that would occur outside of a natural conversation you would be having with another person, people pick up on that, right? And they're aware that they're being therapized or, whatever's going on that they don't want. And it often inadvertently will escalate, like you said, because, they're aware that you're not approaching them and engaging them as another person who genuinely cares. You're operating from some sort of a rule book or guidebook that you have been trained on. And yeah, it can be very disingenuous.
Or doing it as part of a job when it's apparent that that's what you're doing can also escalate then.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm sure you've had a lot of experience in this area where I'm sure you've had to first make sure you were calm enough to apply what you know. Then you had to manage the situation. So can you speak to us about that, some of your experiences?
Yeah. So there's quite a few experiences I could kind of call on. But I think when it comes to especially de-escalating yourself and making sure that you're ready and prepared to engage in a de-escalation, again, kind of going back to that, am I unsafe or am I uncomfortable? And there's actually, I've seen a pretty good infographic that's been circulating online regarding this lately. And so essentially we read a lot of situations in which we are uncomfortable as unsafe. And that immediately causes us to escalate ourselves and kind of enter that fight or flight response. And the reason for that is usually based in stereotypes or stigma. And of course, if you're in a situation that requires de-escalation, the risk of danger exists, but it's not always imminent, essentially, especially with a mental health crisis. It can look very big and scary, but it's usually not going to end in in what you have envisioned in your mind, right? So it's always important to kind of check in with yourself, and ask yourself, am I unsafe right now, or am I just uncomfortable with what's happening?
I guess this is why media portrayals can be so damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you watch however the many movies that have come out over the years regarding people with mental health struggles and stuff, it's always murder and, the absolutely worst case scenario in every situation, or, that one news story that'll come out about somebody who was experiencing psychosis and attacked a random passerby and was so horrible and awful. And yeah, those things are horrible and awful, but they're definitely an outlier in terms of, the amount of people having a mental health crisis in your city on a daily basis. That happens once in a blue moon, right? So
Yeah, one thing I'd add to in terms of the climate we're at in Canada, the social climate, is that there's a lot of awareness around residential school survivors. And I'm noticing like settler societies really ties into the reality that residential school survivors were at one point Indigenous children. So you see the social commentary refer to children, forced removal of children, impacts of trauma on children. But one of the big awarenesses I'm noticing amongst, students who take my class and undergraduates is that the realization that the stereotypes they've been informed about Indigenous people, chances are, the people that they see, the people that they interact with on the streets are struggling in life. Chances are they are residential school survivors, or they are the children of residential school survivors. And so that's why, I really like what Emma said in terms of having to be mindful that, that these are human beings, like they are human beings. And from our perspective, there are people. So being super mindful that, the uncle on the corner, the auntie on the corner, likely experienced trauma, and how do we support them in meaningful, wholesome ways that are safe. And again, for some people, they still view Indigenous people on the corner, or people going through struggles, as potential threats. Police being one, right? And that's just like assuming the worst situations about our people. But again, from my perspective, it's so important to shift that understanding that our people experience trauma, we experience colonialism, and it's really interesting to see a younger generation emerge that make the correlation and the causation between homelessness and people struggling in the inner city, making that link as a direct result of colonialism and a direct result of residential school. So perspective matters. Being trauma informed matters. Even in context of this conversation, history matters. There's really more going on in terms of people's lives, and that does have to inform how we approach crisis and de-escalation.
yeah, absolutely. From a statistical perspective, 74% of the population that we work with are direct residential school survivors. So yeah, being trauma informed is incredibly important for any de-escalation situation, but particularly if you're dealing with, in the Canadian context, Indigenous people, and in a broader context, anyone who is from a community that's experienced, severe intergenerational trauma or systemic oppression, things like that. And yeah, recognizing what's called a pain-based behavior is a part of that trauma-informed perspective to de-escalation. Sorry. So yeah, pain-based behaviors can be physical, emotional, spiritual. There's all different factors to it. We can experience pain in many different ways. And so that's essentially a behavior, an emotion, or a response that's coming from a place of pain. So we, in the practice that I utilize both at work and in grassroots, we kind of rely on an acronym known as HALT. So you always want to kind of consider whether or not a person is hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And that's just kind of something you're doing as a mental check-in with yourself. So those are kind of like the key pain-based behaviors that will lead to an escalation. Usually it's one of those four things that's kind of pushing somebody in that direction. And that can also inform your practice too, in regards to caring gestures and co-regulation.
So trauma informed then means not just looking at somebody on their terms, right? Not just looking at them in isolation, but also thinking about all the things that have influenced them, that have impacted them, that have brought them here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of just approaching the situation with empathy and a broader understanding of any and all encompassing factors that have brought this person to this point right in front of you at this moment.
And so in speaking about crisis, and we're talking about ways that de-escalation might be needed in ways that people haven't thought about, like de-escalating yourself. And I think another situation then is like not harming others, but harming yourself. So Emma, have you ever had to use what you know to intervene or stop someone from harming themselves?
Yeah, definitely. It's a very similar approach as to what you would use to de-escalate another person or even yourself. Although in a way it can be a bit, I guess, easier. If somebody's actively trying to harm themselves, that's a very clear case of a pain-based behavior. Right? It's almost always an internally based factor. And co-regulation and caring gestures work amazingly in those situations usually.
What do you mean by co-regulation?
So co-regulation is just kind of a practice of sitting with somebody in whatever it is that they're going through and relying on your mannerisms, your emotions, your feelings, your responses to kind of guide theirs as well. And vice versa, honestly. So again, a lot of body language, active listening, validating any kind of feelings or thoughts or emotions that a person is going through. Yeah.
Mylan, I know you work with young people and the community a lot. How much of what you do is teaching emotional regulation? Because that's really what de-escalation is, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things for me is evolves around in general, like emotional intelligence, like increasing, people being mindful of their emotions and even what they're called. Right. So from the perspective, from like the perspective of emotional intelligence, being able to speak to and identify that emotion clearly, and even to the point of where it physically shows up in the body. Like, where am I feeling this emotion? Where is it coming up strongest? And so being able to verbalize that, right, and recognizing them as from my perspective, from our cosmology and understanding, as like this energy in motion, right? That this energy is coming up for a reason. Express it, feel it in healthy ways, right? And I feel like that's really important in the climate we're living in right now as Indigenous people, because there was a lot of emotional shutdown. There was a lot of emotional shaming, even to the point of where in some of our communities, it's only safe to like experience happiness or anger. Right? It's like those are the two like emotions that you're often going to see physically expressed. And then so like sadness and fear, sometimes gets hushed hush, even like around toxic masculinity and fear. Like, there's very real like toxic social norms that men don't express their fear or express their sadness, which is a lie, right? Because emotions come up. So first step for me is always being able to identify the emotion, and be able to put words to that and recognize that it's going to come, it's going to go. And in terms of regulation, I think it's really important to be mindful that, first and foremost, that, emotions are energy. They come and go, validating that, speaking to that, and asking what's really like triggering this emotion. Like, where is it really coming from? Why am I angry? Why am I feeling sadness? Or even being able to regulate to the point of identifying what's beneath this. Like, why am I presenting myself in terms of like being angry? Well, what's really here for me is fear. right? So I'm angry that, something's happening, but what's really here for me is a fear that something's going to get out of hand. So I'm responding in an angry way. So this is all like emotional intelligence conversation. And that's something my family really fosters amongst each other, and especially with like the young children in our family now. And I get so happy when my daughters are expressing emotion freely and openly, because there was a time in our collective history as Indigenous people where we weren't allowed to be emotional, where children weren't allowed to cry. So, disrupting that. And once that happens for me, there is an emotional clarity, being able to think clearly, being able to problem solve effectively, like maintain a stronger sense of like situational awareness around, what community am I working in, and what's really going on here, and how are we responding to things. So yeah, I mean, for me, the foundation is first and foremost emotional intelligence.
So then with feeling things like anger, instead of telling them, don't be angry or don't get angry, it's more about trying to put words to that, trying to understand where you're feeling that, where that's arising from.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Like, why are we angry right now? What's coming up for us? Like, what's causing this anger to be so strong in this moment? And, like, I like how Emma said, HALT, the acronym HALT really comes in handy too for me working with children. Because, that does sort of facilitate them being able to link that emotion to a circumstance or something that's going on in their lives. And then being able to problem solve that, or, contextualize that clearly from the point of like an emotional clarity. Because people can't problem solve when you're like your emotions are coming up really strong, right? So, being able to get that to that place of emotional clarity is really important. And again, just acknowledging that emotion, like it's completely fine for children or people to have emotions. I still kind of get baffled at, the conversation that emotions are unprofessional, our emotions are shouldn't be tolerated in certain spaces, and there's a certain extent of privacy with some emotions that people want to have. But at the same time, as a father, I really want my daughters to be able to express themselves emotionally clearly and openly.
Emma, how do you put yourself in a state to even de-escalate or help others? Because I'm sure your adrenaline is sometimes pumping. Maybe you're in a fight, flight, freeze response.
It's definitely something that comes with practice for sure. But I think kind of the key to it is basically what we've been talking about. Is you really have to decenter yourself in the situation, and center the humanity of the person, the situation, and their experiences that have kind of led them to this point. And again, the outlying factors, the pain-based behaviors, kind of how Mylan was saying, what a lot of things will present as anger, but if you kind of root into it, that's not what it is at all at its core. And so you just kind of have to maintain a sense of self-awareness and understanding of that throughout the process, essentially, and constantly check in with yourself and remind yourself of that.
So to remember that it's not about you, don't make it about yourself. Be oriented on what's happening, the situation and the other person.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost never about you, even if the person is making personal attacks against you verbally. And again, I'm speaking in the perspective of the community that I work with. Obviously, if you're approached by a Nazi on the street, that's a different scenario. But yeah, it's almost always has nothing to do with you, regardless of how personal it may feel. And so you really need to detach from that and maintain a strong sense of self-awareness and like Mylan said, emotional maturity throughout the process as well, which is very difficult to do sometimes. It's definitely a practiced behavior.
Then what are some unconscious things one might do to escalate a situation or even escalate themselves that people might not realize they're even doing?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is body language and nonverbal communication. We are always saying a lot more than we think we are. And so it's important to kind of maintain a calm and open body language and be mindful of your facial expressions, I think that's a huge one. Again, that's kind of like a practiced behavior that you develop over time with self-awareness. Also, like we were talking about before, being overly clinical and having a non-humanistic approach. You're going to get the best results in a de-escalation if you're connecting with the person, and talking to them as an equal, one-on-one, and just kind of showing up for them in a way that acknowledges you see them as a person and not as this, big scary person on the street or whatever.
Stranger danger.
Yeah, exactly. Even when someone is presenting themselves as dangerous, that's the intention they're conveying. 90% of the time, if they realize that that's how they're being received, there's an instant emotional reaction to that, because it instantly brings up feelings of rejection or being less than or whatever, and so that can make things quite a bit worse. I think another one too is people like to try to rush to a solution or an expected outcome. Obviously, it's, an intense moment, and you usually want to get it over and done with as quick as possible. But that can be a pretty big mistake to make, especially if you're kind of leveraging ultimatums or not listening to what the person is saying, not validating them, attempting to touch or disarm somebody prematurely. Touch can be a very useful tool in de-escalation, but you really have to have the right rapport with the person, and it has to be done in a very correct way. And there's all sorts of nuance and factors there, of course, too, regarding consent and everything else. But attempting to touch somebody, even in a gentle way, or disarm them prematurely. And then also, kind of what I was saying before, expressing fear or discomfort. It can be very dehumanizing, and it can often set somebody off even further if they know that you perceive them as a danger or a threat, rather than as a person who has very big emotions that need to be validated.
Because even doing that makes the person feel othered.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for me, as a martial artist growing up in this world, I'm sure there's a lot of people, when they're engaging in de-escalation, learning about it, there's a lot to unlearn, because things I've learned and things a lot of people have been told, not even in a formal setting, sometimes just from word of mouth, or like somebody's giving you some advice about self-defense. The things that are common knowledge are forms of escalation, not de-escalation, because oftentimes you're taught to attack first, or make ultimatums or threats, or immediately take a fighting posture when you feel uncomfortable, or you're taught to talk with your hands. So your hands are up high, so it can immediately turn into a fighting stance. And I think from this conversation, we realize those are all things that are actually escalating the situation, not de-escalating the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people who don't have experience with de-escalation kind of come to it assuming that the goal is to restrain or posture or be bigger and scarier, and that's how you successfully de-escalate a situation, which is absolutely not the case.
Like try to scare them off.
Yeah, exactly. Try to scare them off, try to somehow wrestle them into submission, whether that be like literally in a physical sense or, with words and actions.
Subordinate them.
Yeah, de-escalation it's not a moment for you to be a hero. Absolutely not the case. And I think the concept of that comes from cop culture, unfortunately.
I agree.
Yeah, it's a lot of vigilantism, a lot of, people watching too many superhero movies, and everyone wants their time to shine, I guess, right? But
yes.
Yeah, it's definitely not the space for that. Almost ever, I would argue. There's definitely going to be scenarios in which you do need to physically restrain or disarm somebody, but That's also not something anyone should be doing without the proper training to do so. That can be incredibly dangerous in itself to both you and the other person. So, yeah, I mean, in perspective of my work, we unfortunately make a small fraction of what a police officer's salary is. But we effectively disarm guns, knives, pipes, all sorts of things very frequently without any kind of violent incident. So, yeah, this notion that you need to immediately depend on violence, it's just not reality.
So you're going to like the last resort right away.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are skilled in de-escalation, it almost will never come to that. Like it's very, very rare. I can say in my experience doing this work and having to participate in multiple de-escalations almost every day, both myself and, my coworkers or my co-organizers, it almost never comes to needing a physical intervention of any kind.
Yeah, I'd add to that too and say that in my experience, anything that is approached from the position of like authoritarian doesn't fly so well, especially working with like Indigenous children and youth, because, authoritarians are the colonizer, and historically they've been the colonizer, and it just doesn't fly well at all. And I'm really like critical of educators or people who work with children who naturally sort of appropriate like an authoritarian approach. And the other one too that is really prevalent that I really try.
There's kind of that instinct as a bystander to just get on the phone and call 911 immediately as soon as anything is happening, and that's definitely not what you should do as a bystander. Secondly, I think the best thing to do is to not spectate, and so by that I mean you don't want to kind of be, ogling the situation as though you're watching
like a prize fight or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Don't turn it into a spectacle, essentially. I think it's important to kind of take a step back and survey the situation. If you are worried that the person who is participating in a de-escalation might be at risk, keep an eye out. Keep within a safe distance, but don't spectate, essentially. That's always going to make things worse as well.
It's kind of like that schoolyard fight feeling, right? Sometimes like I've had that situation in school where like I'm arguing with somebody, it's escalating, but I don't know if we're going to fight or not. But then when all the kids gather around, then I feel like now I'm obligated to fight this person.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think too, it just becomes like, again, very dehumanizing. Like if you think about yourself when you've been at your worst mentally in terms of how you're feeling, like we've all had moments in life where we're, not doing great. Imagine if there was a crowd of people standing around you watching you in that moment and how vulnerable, scared, dehumanized you would feel. It's just going to make things worse because, again, kind of how we were talking about earlier, fear often presents as anger. So if someone feels threatened or vulnerable in a situation because there's a crowd gathering, it's probably just going to escalate them even further. If you are kind of witnessing a situation where somebody is engaging in a de-escalation and they seem like they have it under control, just don't get involved, honestly. One of the key components of effectively de-escalating is maintaining a connection with the person. And if you're kind of inserting yourself into that, there's a chance you might break that connection. Again, as I was saying, stand by, keep an eye out in a way that is not, being overly intrusive. But and if they do seem to be struggling or escalating themselves, I would say it's good to attempt to engage in a non-intrusive way. So a good way to do that, again, would be with a caring gesture. You could, ask the person if they want to step back. You could offer a cigarette. Again, I swear by cigarettes. I don't smoke, but I carry them with me at all times because they're a great tool. It's very nuanced and you kind of have to read the room, so to say. But yeah, I think there's kind of that, the two main instincts that come up when you happen upon a situation in public. You either want to, like I said, get on the phone and call 911, or jump in and try to be involved in some way, which can be very harmful, especially if the person is handling it well themselves. So, and then, yeah, I think the last thing as a bystander would be to follow up afterwards with the person who was de-escalating, with the person who needed de-escalating. Just follow up, offer support. Hey, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Again, kind of going back to that notion of community care that Mylan was discussing. Yeah, it's important to kind of follow up afterwards.
So obviously, this isn't talking about police or hate crimes or lynchings. But going back to that mom I was talking about at the outset, could she have been then unknowingly escalating the situation by intervening or making herself known?
It could have been. It's hard to say. I think it also was helpful, though, as you mentioned, that she kind of made herself known. It's very nuanced, and you just kind of have to play it by ear, and you're probably going to make mistakes along the way. Like no situation is going to be the same as the next one. Do you know what I mean? It's all going to be very, very nuanced, and you just kind of have to navigate it as it comes. But yeah.
Let's say you're not an expert at de-escalation and you're in a situation, let's say, with a colonizer. Are there any red flags that this is going to get violent?
I'll jump in because for me, again, like it's a matter of picking your battles. One of the common dynamics that unfolds up here in Canada is there's a known drugstore chain that hires security, and this security, for whatever reason in their training or based off stereotypes, will always follow Indigenous people. And on Facebook, on social media, you'll always see like Indigenous people expose them and be like, oh, you can't shop here because they're always going to follow you. And it's very real. And it happens to me. Like, I guarantee you there's a 95% chance if I get off the call and go to that drugstore chain, I will be followed. That's how confident I am that event will happen. But with that being said, it's a matter of like picking your battles. And for me, I like when people expose the societal aspect of it. But I was just on a call with a friend today, actually, and he was saying that, when it comes to non-Indigenous people, colonizers and settlers, is they have a system behind them. And at any chance where like something is at the risk of being reported or collectively like addressed from the other side, I think it's safe to say, like, withdraw, be mindful. Because like for me, I always tell people, like, if the police show up, there's going to be a bias there. If they get other people involved who are going to be able to side with them, there'll be a systemic bias there. So I have to be really mindful of picking your battles. And obviously, like, from the perspective of like guerrilla warfare, you want to live to fight another day. Like I would never go down, I would never go down or be exposed or, go into legal battles for certain things that are just an everyday occurrence. But at the same time, having to be mindful that there might be situations where, you can expose straight up blatant racism, where you can expose systemic issues very clearly and visibly. And, we experienced that as a family with my brother, who was targeted and attacked by a non-Indigenous person in the local city. And it did make news. It's out there. Like people could Google this. And he was physically attacked. He was basically jumped and assaulted. And it was all on camera, and it was racially motivated. And he chose to, step back in that situation because his my niece was in the truck. And so he completely chose to like disengage and not interact with it. But we came together as a family and we had a conversation on whether or not he wants to release this footage. And he chose to release the footage. And it led to a lot of interesting local social commentary. And there's still like conversations happening about that incident. and me and my brother-in-law, who roll constantly, we started our jiu-jitsu journey together. Like, we constantly like have the conversation of like, how would have we responded in that situation? And it's really hard to say. So like, yeah, like, Emma's correct in saying that it really depends on the situation that you're in and what's going on in that moment, and you have to be mindful. And I agree with my brother's assessment of that situation. My niece was in the car. He wanted to disengage and maintain the distance, and he did fairly well. And the video's out there. I mean, it's out there. There's some trigger warning involved in that video. But yeah, at the same time, the everyday occurrences for me, I'm super mindful because it just takes one phone call to the police that, could mess up your life, or, you could piss off the wrong Karen. And I love how we call out Karens, but at the same time, that's still an act of violence that we're potentially exposing ourselves to. And that we have to be really mindful to pick our battles in general.
Yeah, I think a lot of people got so hyped up about like punching every Nazi they see, but to your point, right? You got to pick your battles.
Yeah, I agree with everything Mylan is saying, and I think, being able to punch every Nazi you see is comes from a place of privilege for sure. And like for myself personally, I have a white parent and I'm fairly white passing, so I don't experience those types of situations quite as often as Mylan would, or anyone else who's more racialized. They do happen, but definitely not in the same frequency. But yeah, I think the key is you have to know your own limits. You have to be self-aware. And for myself personally, in the work setting, and in organizing as well, I know that I can't de-escalate situations where men are being physically violent towards women. It's far too triggering for me. And so I can't de-escalate myself in those situations. And so a tactic that I rely on is communicating that well in advance with my coworkers and my co-organizers. And, if you're out with your friends or whatever, that you might not have that same kind of established relationship with them. But I would argue that you should, because part of building community and community care should be educating each other on these things, and establishing more of a community-based response to situations of crisis, which tends to eliminate the need for police, which is kind of the ultimate goal. So, and then kind of like circling back to some key indicators that you are in danger, and should probably leave the situation. It's if you can't make that connection with the person that I was talking about earlier, which obviously if it's like a racially motivated attack or any other kind of, bigotry, essentially, you're not going to be able to make a connection with that person because they don't see you as a person. So
they're invested in being disconnected from you.
Absolutely. So yeah, if you can't make that connection, it's probably best to just dip out. Another indicator would be obviously if they're already kind of on the physical attack, and then kind of again steering it to the more broader sense away from like a racially motivated attack or whatever. But not necessarily, but if somebody's in psychosis, I think it can be difficult to determine what psychosis is if you're not trained. But it's pretty easy to detect when somebody is kind of experiencing a break from reality, as you mentioned earlier with your personal experience. But I would say if you're encountering somebody in a state of psychosis, they can be de-escalated, but it's very difficult to do without extensive training. If somebody's not experiencing reality, then it's going to be difficult to make a connection with them. And attempting to force them back to reality, it often will make things worse. So I would say if you observe that somebody is probably in an advanced state of psychosis, I probably wouldn't engage as a non-experienced person in a situation like that.
I think we should also talk about the overlooked parts of fight or flight, which is freezing or fawning. Freezing is obviously when you're immobilized. Fawning means seeking approval. which might be being overly compliant. We have to understand those are also survival responses. But we want to check in with ourselves to see if we're making a judgment call or if it's just an automatic response kicking in that may not be serving us. So as both of you mentioned, something as simple as checking in with yourself, recognizing how you feel, and even in that moment of recognizing, you have bought time. Just thinking about de-escalation makes you stop and think, which buys time. And buying time can be for the immediate or for dealing with the immediate while still planning for the long term. I bought time. Should I go for a walk now? Should I leave the situation? Or maybe it's about putting out the immediate fire so you can plan for a long-term solution. These are just examples to help conceptualize that doing something in the immediate doesn't mean it should only be handled in the immediate. But check in with yourself. Make checking in with yourself a habit. Make checking in with others a habit. But ultimately, no one should judge you for whatever you did or didn't do because it was you in that situation and not anyone else. As far as self-defense, more than martial art techniques, the best weapons are your eyes, your ears, your mind, and your feet. Your eyes are so important to perceive your surroundings and your aggressor and to orient yourself. Same with your ears. What you hear can let you know if you're isolated. Did everyone clear out? Are there others around? Then having a clear mind helps you make decisions and quick plans. And your feet help you get out of there. And as far as techniques, generally, what's more important is your level of resistance than the actual technique. Resisting is more important than being John Wick. But resist to do what? A past guest said if the goal of self-defense is escaping, what's more important than parkour, the art of running around obstacles? And I think the point she was trying to make was people don't spend nearly as much time thinking about the process of escaping as they do martial arts techniques, which is true. People also don't spend enough time wayfinding and orienting to their surroundings and knowing where everything is. I work on wayfinding with all the people I train. But combining this with Marxism, your conditions inform your decisions and your wayfinding. So how you escape depends on your conditions, which include your surroundings, but also your own personal state. But at the same time, your personal conditions also affect the situations and surroundings you are in. How I escape in a wheelchair will be different from someone who can run. But at the same time, if I am in a wheelchair, how I orient to the world and my surroundings will be different. And I will be constantly thinking about my surroundings and how it's not designed for me, which means I can't access or inhabit the same spaces as able-bodied people, which means I will most likely be escaping a situation I was able to enter. So it's all context dependent, and how people orient to their environment or what sensors they use to orient or even what environments they inhabit will be context dependent. Even having a stroller made me realize I couldn't inhabit the same spaces I could before having a child. It's easy to say de-escalation is pointless and that if someone wants to hurt you, they will, when for some people, that's the only tool they can use, or it's something they always have to try first. It's not just about whether you're able-bodied or not. Maybe you're always around your community, or you're always working. Then, again, you might be compelled to always try and de-escalate first, rather than gouging the eyes out of a community member or coworker. That doesn't mean de-escalation is the only thing you do, but it might always be part of the solution, if there's a solution at all. But part of wayfinding, even for dangerous situations, is exploring your solution space. It doesn't mean you have total control of the situation. Again, it's all context dependent, and there's no right or wrong. Your way is not my way, and vice versa. The victim should never be blamed, and they aren't at fault. The victimizer is always at fault. But if you say de-escalation is not important or useful, my question is, for whom? Who is this person who lives in a situation where they never need to de-escalate? Even in a situation where someone is intent on isolating you to do you harm, slowing things down, or in a broad sense, somehow creating a moment of pause can give you an opportunity to escape. Maybe fawning can even be temporarily appropriate here, or the fight response. I don't know. But everything you do will take time. So to do something, you need time. And so who doesn't ever need to pause or buy time? Who doesn't ever need a little bit of cooperation? Are there any other times people might need to de-escalate that they might not be aware of?
Yeah, I think parenting is one of the biggest ones. I personally use a lot of my de-escalating strategies with my son. He's neurodivergent and is prone to very big feelings and very big reactions. And it's important to make space for that. And I think, again, kind of circling back to what Mylan was discussing earlier about adult supremacy and those things, and expecting our children to be, fully emotionally regulated beings when we ourselves are often not that. De-escalation strategies in parenting, I think is really vital, really important, both for de-escalating a child that is experiencing some kind of overstimulation episode or some kind of big emotional response, but also for ourselves. I think it's super vital to kind of have those skills and fall back on them as frequently as you can.
I totally agree. I know there's been times where my wife has had to tell me, maybe you should step away, let me handle this with regards to our son. And I've said the same thing to my wife, maybe you need to walk away from this. So there's definitely been times that we've had to de-escalate ourselves, or sometimes the spouse isn't around and I had to just kind of like, okay, let me just get away from him for a second, let him just play or do his thing. And then let me come back to this when I'm ready to handle this, or maybe like save the battle. I'm not going to talk to him about this now. We'll talk about it later. Or even in our own relationship between my wife and I, sometimes we've had to be like, okay, I need to go for a walk. We had to create some space and then come back to this later because we're both getting too like worked up, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, coming at it from the rural aspect, in the communities I was working in, really it is only community in some cases that will have to respond to, family members or community members going through, some kind of crisis, mental health crisis, self-harm crisis, or something that requires, ideally, somebody to be present with the person that's going through it. And having been in situations where we're called, or the place I was working at, we were called to respond to community crisis. It shows up. It's definitely a skill that you have to be mindful of and begin to foster and hone in terms of like, what happens if I get the call that that somebody's facing a very real challenge in their life. What am I going to do in that space? For me, when it comes to community care, and I know Emma stated it too, is that we want to avoid police response. And I tell that to families. I tell that in the communities I work in, is that, the best person that could potentially respond to someone in crisis would be either a friend or a family member if they're willing. And to, to hold that space until, ideally, some mental health professional or some mental health team can get there if the community has it, because not every community has those options. But it does boil down to literally being present with people, seeing where they're at, recognizing them as, a living, breathing human being, and not responding from a place of authoritarianism, not judging them, and literally talking and talking in terms of like them literally being a friend or a community member or a family member, and really identifying the next steps forward. Like, for example, responding to crisis that around self-harm, having to talk people down and come up with a game plan, and really shifting focus, and then also keeping in mind that you're now, if it is a rural aspect, if you're the only person that this person has access to in those situations, you are technically going to have to help them in a longer run. And I still maintain relationships with communities I worked with, and youth and community members I worked with, and we still plan, we still problem solve. And again, that's a very non-clinical approach. That's not necessarily like a professional approach, because there's always like a handoff, or there's always like, a referral. But when it comes to community care, teamwork really does make the dream work. And I mean, families need to come together and ideally communicate in terms of the crisis they're facing, or the crisis that people are facing, or their nieces and nephews are facing, and openly communicate, the needs of the family member, the needs of the person, and come up with game plans to ideally mitigate colonizer response, like police response. And I do see families doing that now. Like, I do see, the conversations on social media around like wellness checks and things like that. But at the same time, there's still lots of work to do. Like, that's why I'm glad you're having this conversation on de-escalation, and even, me speaking to community care. Because, I mean, there's a whole avenue that we have to explore and normalize in terms of responding to crisis, because it can be scary. It can be very scary. But at the same time, in my mind, for the times I did respond to crisis, I mean, I'm glad I did. Like, I'm glad I was there. I'm glad that I was there for, those young people that were facing that crisis. And talking with them today, they tend to lean to say that, they were surprised it was me. Surprised I showed up. But again, like, literally my goal in those situations was to beat the police there. So, I mean, it really does like boil down to being mindful, having the community care aspect, knowing your community, knowing your friendships, your friend community, knowing your family community, and just being mindful that, hey, it may be me that has to make this call. And so I may as well work on these skill sets while I can. So I'm not, so I don't have, at least I will have some tools in the tool belt for when something does happen.
And it seems like, as Emma mentioned, right, one of the best ways to de-escalate, and something we all use and don't think about, is checking in. You check in with yourself to de-escalate yourself. And in that same way, I think when you check in with your community, check in with others, that is also a form of de-escalation. Maybe somebody's going through something, and then you just check in. You don't even know they're going through something. And even something like that can really help them. And I think another common way that this appears in our families, even in our friend groups, is through intervention, right? We sometimes even jokingly call it that, but what is that, right? We're like saying there's something happening, there's something escalating, there's something spiraling, and we need to talk about it as a group of friends, as a family. Maybe it's that tough conversation before the family seeks some kind of family therapy or couples therapy, or maybe somebody in the friend group is engaging in some kind of harmful behavior and is spiraling, or it's getting worse. It could be about substance abuse. It could be about, you're not quite sure what's happening with somebody, but you're seeing them act in ways that they don't normally act, and it's getting more erratic, right? And so we've done this before, but we never actually consciously thought too much about it. So we don't even do it as often as we need to. This act of checking in, of intervening, right? And so if we think about it as a process, as a form of care, then we could approach these things more thoughtfully, be aware that we use it a lot more often than we think we do. And if we realize we use it a lot more often than we think we do, then we ought to be more considerate about it, more thoughtful about it, get better at it. Did either of you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to add a bit onto what Mylan was talking about with regards to like in rural settings, you don't really have a lot of services or resources you can rely on, which is very true. But in most city centers, there are crisis teams that exist that operate independently of police, and it's important to familiarize yourself with those. So if you ever are in a situation, that's who your first line of contact will be before police. For example, where I am, it's you dial 211 and they send out a team of trained crisis response workers. They're not cops, they're not paramedics, they're not any of those institutionalized bodies of oppression for many people.
And for a lot of people, just seeing them could be triggering, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're just frontlines workers, plain clothes. They show up. They often have harm reduction supplies or food or resources or a plethora of resources that they can offer to people. So that should always be your first line of contact. If you do live in a city center, I think it's important to familiarize yourself with what that phone number or contact line might be. And then in addition, in rural settings, there are things that exist. For example, like suicide first aid training exists. De-escalation training exists. These things can be inaccessible in regards to money and finances, of course. But I think if you have the means to do so as a community and come together and kind of, designate some people that you could provide access to those trainings and stuff to kind of be that resource person within that community. I think that's an important solution as well if it's within your means.
Yeah, and then I'll even like exploring the option depending on like what community you're in. Like maybe there is a need to create a team. Maybe, collectively the community comes together and says, hey, we need people to respond to this, and, getting, governance conversations going on how that's going to happen. Because I worked in communities where there weren't teams, and then, later they decided the need to make some teams to respond. And yeah, it comes down like with what you were saying too, Sam, is that, families, we tend to know what's going on in our family systems, and sometimes it's emotional no-go zones and we don't want to discuss it. But I mean, if not you, then who, right? Like no one, if you're recognizing behaviors or patterns, then it's good to ideally have enough family care to be able to address them and support one another. And that's very true for like, I feel like a lot of Indigenous or, family systems that are more communal based and more immediate based. And that extends to friendships too. Like I agree. It's like checking in with your friends, seeing what's going on. If they're struggling times, just see how things are going. Because there's also like this concept of like mapping out your society, like mapping out your kinship system. So that, if something does happen, we have these people to draw on and we know who's related to who. And so like, that's a form of community mapping that is, I would even say is even a form of wayfinding too. Looking at your work, who are we be depending on, and where are we existing as community members together?
And just listening to this, especially thinking about the examples you gave about residential schools or HALT, and how a lot of care workers, frontline workers will show up just with food. And you realize a lot of these crises comes from a crisis of need or a crisis of lacking. It's like Squid Games, right? Where people just don't have enough. They haven't been provided enough. They've been neglected or they've been oppressed. And it creates this pressure. And that pressure sometimes erupts. It comes out in a way that people aren't able to contain or control anymore, right? And so by zooming out, we see that this is ultimately symptoms of a systemic problem, a societal problem that's been going back and it's historical, to Mylan's point. So to be trauma-informed, to be care-informed, we also can't just look at the person. We have to look at these things and the history of these things that have been affecting our community and the people we know and the people we come in contact with.
Yeah. So inherently, like in this conversation, obviously there's a degree of anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism. Because like, one of the big issues right now that I feel leads to a lot of commentary on like economics and jobs, right? So there's like this whole big push for people to get jobs and job training, job center training, even like life skills pertaining to employment is a big one in Indigenous communities today. But no one's really having like a very critical conversation around capitalism and around the reality that, there's very real systemic problems existing in our communities as a result of colonization. So it's almost like we're on a hamster wheel of like literally not addressing the bigger picture. And, some people jump on that hamster wheel and want to run fastest. And, and for whatever reason, that's their mission. That's their goal. But from the structural lens, we really need to be willing to foster a sense of community care that's politically conscious, that's socially and economically conscious, to again, like really get to the root problems of why our communities are in crisis and addressing those crises and again offering adequate and quality community care approaches that, could get these conversations going. Because a lot of the depression, in my mind, and even in my own life, a lot of the depression and a lot of the struggle is the result of, having to be like a productive member of society, or having to have a clear cut career path. But, for Indigenous people, that's an ongoing colonial conversation we have internally, is how are we going to survive? And, you even get to the point of where people are shaming our own people, like our own people are shaming our own people for not working hard enough, or, like the bootstrap conversation, or being unproductive.
I think bootstrap has leveled up to grind culture, and that's really, I think, toxic and damaging.
100%, 100%. And it's even leveling up to like people, believing in economic and social paradigms of like billionaires and things like that, and like just regurgitating some of the cheesiness that's coming out of that. But, in my mind, oppressed people are the hardest working people in the world today. Indigenous people are the hardest working people in the world today, because, so much goes into us trying to stay alive. So much energy goes into us trying to, be able to live another day, like being able to stay on track, because society was not designed for us, and it was not designed by us. So the economic system was not designed for us. It's not designed by us. And we're all dealing with those, those impacts on our mental health, on our family systems. And like, that's why on my posts and my conversations, I always say that we're all navigating this chaotic colonial world. So the last thing that we should be doing is judging each other for trying to find our way forward. So again, for me, like, it really depends on community care. The cheesy line of teamwork makes the dream work. Like, that's my dad reference now, because I always say it. But there's a little bit of truth to that. Like, we do need to come together as families and peoples again, and really shift focus to identifying the problems and addressing those problems.
Yeah, just to expand on that a bit too, the same thing that Mylan's discussing in regards to this push for employment, we see the exact same thing in regards to the push for housing as well. There's this really bad habit of, getting people housed by any means necessary, but then leaving them entirely unsupported in that. And it becomes very isolating. We see a lot of people returning to the streets, even though they have a home. They're still sleeping out in encampments every night because that's their community, that's their family. And as Indigenous people, that's our lifeblood. That's so important to us, it's this colonial mindset of, you just need a job and a house and everything's going to be a-okay and you'll be just fine. And, it's nothing could be further from the truth. There's, that aspect of community care absolutely needs to exist. And it becomes very cyclical, because people will, they'll get housed, they'll go to detox or rehab of some sort. And, they'll be on the straight and narrow, as society would call it. But then they get lonely and isolated and return back to, hanging out with their street friends and visiting their street friends, because, well, I shouldn't even say friends, it's family, street family. And, if those people are still using them, they get pulled back into that cycle. But it's not the substances that they're longing for, it's the community. So, community care is vital for sure.
So I think we covered a lot in this episode, and I think this is a good way to get the conversation started. And hopefully people will digest this and give us more things to think about. And that's how we'll end up covering this topic again. But before we wrap up, Emma, is there anything you wanted to plug or mention?
There's nothing personal that I wanted to plug, but I do just want to encourage people to identify their local harm reduction focused nonprofits and grassroots organizations and initiatives, and support them. The opioid epidemic is reaching a insane crisis point. Thousands of people are dying all across Turtle Island, and even locally, the Treaty 6 Confederacy has just recently declared a state of emergency. We're losing about 6 people per day just in the city that I live in. So Yeah, and this is not just an issue that's connected to the prairies or Canada even. It's global. But yeah, connect to any kind of harm reduction focused nonprofit in your area, support them, learn what harm reduction is, carry naloxone and learn how to use it. And
Carry a what?
so naloxone is it's an opioid reversal substance. So you can administer it either intramuscularly or nasally. There's 2 different options. It's very easy to use. You don't need any medical training. And if somebody is in active overdose because of opioids, it'll reverse it almost instantly. Yeah, it saves lives. So it's important to have. And yeah, just remembering that our unhoused neighbors are still our neighbors. And it's important that we're treating them that way.
My area used to have a lot of low income apartments. Since the pandemic, they've all been like destroyed, and they've put up these new luxury condos everywhere so that rich liberals here can do Airbnb. So I've seen some of my neighbors, as in people who lived in different apartments on my street, now actually on the street.
Yeah, the pandemic has definitely exacerbated it, and the opioid epidemic and the housing epidemic go hand in hand. And if you look at the statistics, drug poisoning response, or what is commonly known as an overdose, has pretty much tripled since 2020 when the pandemic started. So, yeah, for sure, the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of that, unfortunately. So it's important now more than ever to be supporting any kind of organization supporting those people.
And Mylan, things you wanted to plug, and also where can people find you?
Yeah, I mentioned adult supremacy. My brother Colby Tootoosis has a cool little article out and some of the work he does, so people could Google that. And also, the incident that did take place with him. So yeah, you can look into that if you want. But yeah, listen to Radical Narrative. We have episodes coming out. Not really much other than keep listening to Southpaw.
Thank you both for coming on the show.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me again.